and the news cycle is getting faster, and Georgia is a country that's not that often in the news occasionally, and now it's getting faster in Politico and in these outlets. We've learned 4 or 5 days ago that the unofficial leader of the Georgian Dream Party, the big brain and muscle behind the current government, Bidzina Ivanishvili, suggested that maybe Georgia should apologize to South Ossetia for what happened in 2008. I mean, because we know that it was the Saakashvili government, the Georgian government, that fired the first shots over the border, killing South Ossetians and even a couple of Russian peacekeepers who were there at the time with a proper mandate. The On the other hand, we've now learned just a couple of hours ago that the EU apparently is thinking of suspending visa-free travel to the Schengen area for Georgians if the EU should deem that the upcoming elections in October are not democratic enough. Alexander, what do you make out of this news?
Well, let's deal with the second one first, about this warning from the European Union if it's happened. Of course, it's happened before the election has actually taken place. So doing it in that kind of way, and again, it's not something which we're absolutely sure about, but it's consistent with the way the EU behaves. It's effectively a warning to Georgians: vote for the opposition, because if you don't vote for the opposition, we might say, well, we've got concerns about the way in which the election was conducted, and you will find that visa-free travel to Europe, which is something which a lot of people in Georgia, I have no doubt, value greatly, well, that might be taken away from you. So it's a signal to Georgians that they should vote a certain way. That is how I would see it. And given that we haven't had the election yet, given that we've got no reason at the moment, well, maybe we've got lots of reasons, but we haven't seen anything happen in the election which would lead us to think that the decision that we're going to get is going to be a wrong one. It's an astonishing thing to say before the election happens. But the other thing, the other big story, that the one you mentioned, which is the South Ossetia, the apology to South Ossetia. Now, I think this is actually, if, and again, it's a big if it happens, if the current government is re-elected and we start moving in that direction towards a reconciliation between Georgia and South Ossetia, I think that will be very consequential, because it will unblock potentially the major problems that we have in this area of the Southern Caucasus, because we had the war in 2008. The war in 2008 made it very difficult for Georgia and South Ossetia to find a way forward. Georgia, of course, still considers South Ossetia to be part of Georgia. South Ossetia considers itself to be independent. Russia recognizes South Ossetia as independent. When Russia recognized South Ossetia as independent, there were concerns in Moscow that that might make it impossible in the long term to rebuild a relationship with Georgia itself. So you could argue that this step, if it happens, will start to move things towards a position where a general reconciliation might actually take place, where Georgia, South Ossetia, and of course, ultimately Russia could find a more workable modus vivendi than we've seen up to now. So it's the kind of, I would say, sensible step that a government takes, in that it needs to try and find some way to stabilize its relations with its near neighbors. But of course, it's going to be very controversial in Georgia. It's going to be very controversial in the West. Inevitably, it is going to be seen as a further sign that Georgia, if this current government is re-elected, is tilting towards Moscow. Because the other problem is that everything about these elections in Georgia is perceived in the West specifically, but not just, I think, in the West, in geopolitical terms. So the Georgians might have all kinds of reasons for voting for one party or another. But as far as the world is concerned, it's all about Georgia's relationship with Russia, whether Georgia is making a pro-Russian turn or it's going to stick with a pro-Western course. And that is ultimately why the European Union is making the threats that it is and doesn't want to see the current government re-elected.
And at this point, I need